A warm greeting to everyone. I am Kayla Shai Cardel, the first discussant from the fourth group. We are going to talk about the section 2 of language variation focuses on users, which is specifically delved in regional and social variation and social dialects. Unlike the previous discussion which talks about the multilingual communities, on this section, we are going to focus on monolingual communities' language variation. Monolingual communities are a community which knows and uses only one language. Let's begin the discussion by answering these two questions. First, why does language become one's social identity? Next, how can people identify other individuals' social network and background through language? So language becomes one's social identity because the people use the language to signal their membership to a group or to construct different aspects of their social identities. Therefore, people identify other individuals' social network and background through the use of the language using the social status, gender, age, ethnicity, and the kinds of social networks that people belong to, emphasizing its importance in the different dimension of identity in many communities. To explain further, let me illustrate the way people use the language for such purposes using the example presented in this slide. We have two examples here from the module, which is the conversation of Pat and the caller, and the localized example I provided similarly. Based on two examples, Pat and Kayla were able to identify that the caller was a young and well-educated despite the short conversation. Usually, if the caller is an adult, it is easy to tell whether a speaker is a female or male. Well, if the person has a distinctive regional accent, then their regional origins will be evident. Therefore, one can guess another person's social economic status and educational background through concluding with a short utterance. In similar terms, it stresses that the most listener can identify that the caller's identity without any problem due to the infinite sources of variation in speech, such as the gender, age, and many more, which will be deeply discussed by the next group. No two people speak exactly the same because of the infinite sources of variation in speech, wherein a single vowel may be pronounced in the hundreds of minutely different ways, most of which listener do not even register. Some features of speech, however, are shared by groups and become more important because they differentiate one group from another. Just as different languages often serves as a unifying and separating functions for their speaker, so do the speech characteristic within a language. For example, by the pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary of Scottish speakers of English is in some respect, it is quite distinct from the people in England, which is somehow similar from the Masbateñans to Sorsoganon of Bicol speech utterances, where some pronunciation and grammar are similar but differ in vocabulary. For example, the word karanam means to steal in Masbate, while it is to play in Sorsogon. Moreover, speech provides social information just like dropping the initial H in words like house and heaven by saying the house and even often indicates a lower socioeconomic background in English. And so does the use of grammatical patterns such as they don't know nothing them kids or I done it last week. So here we signal our group affiliation and group social identities with the speech forms we use. In regional variation, the language in international varieties is distinguished into three, and these are by the distinctive vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. Wherein in regional variation there are many such stories, some no doubt a procopal of mistakes based on regional accent differences. Also, there are vocabulary differences in such varieties spoken in different regions. Some examples are presented on this slide, such as in accent. The word dad pronounced by a New Zealander would sound like dead to a British speaker, but bad would also sound like bed. The word God pronounced by the American would sound like guard to a British speaker. Ladder would also be sound like ladder. In vocabulary, Australians use the form of solo parents, while the people of England use single parents, and the New Zealanders call them solo parents, and the American speaker would say gas, while the British would say petrol, elevator instead of lift, and luggage instead of baggage. Continuing, there are grammatical differences too, not just the pronunciation and vocabulary differences that are probably the differences that people are most aware of between the different dialects of English. Using example A and B on the slide, question A, do you have a match? And question B is, have you got a cigarette? Shows that the speaker of US English tend to prefer do you have, though this can also be heard in Britain along the side of traditional English, have you got? Some Americans can say gotten where while the people in England use got. In New Zealand, where US forms are usually regarded as more innovative, younger New Zealanders say dove, while older New Zealanders use dive. Thus, with the grammatical differences, it is easy to distinguish the preferred US and British usage in the sentences. But to further understand, let me show you a short video of the same case scenario.
4 candles. 4 candles. Here you are. 4 candles. No, 4 candles. Well, there you are, 4 candles. No, 4 candles. Handles for forks. You let me on, aren't you? There we go. Pumps, hand pumps. Hand pumps, foot pumps. Foot pumps. Foot pumps. Foot pumps. There we are. No pumps for your feet, brown pump size 9. You are having me on, you are definitely having me on. Washers? What, windscreen washers, car washers, dishwashers, floor washers, back scrubbers, lavatory cleaners, floor washers? Half-inch washers. Tap washers, tap washers. Yeah. Look, I've had about enough to speak about this. Speaking of myself down here, what's this? What's that? Oh, that does it. That does have it. I've had just about enough of this. Mr. Jones, you come out, service customer, please. I've just about had enough of this. Who is Scott? Who is Scott? Right, how many do you like, 1 or 2?
So, this emphasizes that the varieties are crucial in a conversation. Given that the example provided, miscommunication and mistake often happen between the people who have different accents. The differences that English speakers throughout the world notice when they meet English speakers from other nations are like those noted by speakers of other languages too. Between Spanish and French, for example, are languages which are extensively used in a variety of countries besides Spain and France. Speaker of Spanish can hear differences of pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar in the varieties of Spanish spoken in Mexico, Spain, Argentina, and Paraguay, for example. Native speaker of French can distinguish the French used in Montreal from Parisian and Haitian French. There are differences in the vocabulary of different varieties, so, for example, a Parisian travail work is a job in Montreal. The word for beggar is médiant in France but quétex in Quebec. And Canadian tends to use the aller voir en film, while Parisian prefer aller au cinéma. Even grammatical gender assignments differs in 2 varieties. Appetite or appetite and midi or midday, for instance, are feminine in Canada, but masculine in France, while the opposite is true for automobile and oriel or ear. Clearly, Canadian French and Parisian French are different dialects. Sometimes the differences between dialects are a matter of the frequency with which particularly features occur, rather than completely different ways of saying things. People in Montreal, for example, do not always pronounce the L in phrases like L plate and L fate. Parisian omit the L too, but less often. That's why if you learned the French in school, you probably struggled to learn which verbs use avoir or use the atre in marking the perfect aspect. Getting control of this pattern generally causes of all kinds of headaches. It would probably have caused you even more pain if you had realized that the patterns of using avoir and atre are different in Montreal and Paris. Moving on in intranational and intracontinental variation, usage of 2 modals might could is how typically Georges speak for many English speakers. This may come off awkward, or rather a thought of saying that it is grammatically incorrect may come to a person's mind. In this situation, we deal with the differences of the accent and dialect within a country, since the distinguishing the forms of individual grammatical usages and lexical items as well as pronunciation in the United Kingdom. For example, the Cockney is distinct from the Scots and Geordie. Based on the samples shown, this conversation between 2 Geordies is likely to perplex many English speakers. The double modal might could is typically Geordie, though it is also heard in some parts of southern USA. The expression needs dump is also typically Tyneside, though also used in Scotland. The way English is pronounced is also quite distinctive in italicized and perhaps especially in intonation patterns. Dialectologists can distinguish regional varieties for almost every English in country. Some British dialects, such as Scots and Cockney and Geordie, even have distinct names showing how significant they are in distinguishing groups from one another. Within the London area, the Cockney dialect is quite distinctive with its glottal stop C instead of T between vowels in words like bitter and butter. The Linguistic Atlas projects provide a social sources of information on the features of pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary, which distinguish different U.S. dialects. In the rural of Appalachians, one can hear pronunciations such as across and cliff, plus verbs with a prefix such as a fishing and a coming. In areas where English has been introduced more recently, such as Australia and New Zealand, there seems to be less regional variation, though there is evidence of social variation. The high level of international communication together with the relatively small population may have been inhibited the development of marked regional differences in these countries. In New Zealand, for instance, there are greater differences among the Maori dialects than with the English. This may be because of the longer period of settlement and more restrictive means of communication between different Maori tribes before European settler arrived. The Maori pronunciations of words written in initial W, for example, differs from one place to another. In New Zealand, for instance, there are greater differences among the Maori dialects than within English. The Maori word for fish is ika in most areas, but ngonhi in the far north, and kirikiri refers to gravel in the west but sand in the East Auckland. A map of England shows where different dialect words are used for the standard English word splinter. The boundary lines drawn between areas where different grammatical usages or pronunciations occur are called glosses. This is just a one word out of thousands of linguistic features which vary in different dialects and which were documented by Harold Orton's comprehensive survey of English dialects in 1950s. When all the information on linguistic regional variation is gathered on a map, which glosses are drawn between areas where different vocabulary or grammatical usages or pronunciation occur, the result looks like something like a spider's web. Some of the web's lines are thicker than others because several boundaries between features coincide. But there are also a great deal of overlap between these areas. The same vocabulary may be used throughout an area where contrast in the different pronunciation of words are quite dramatic. In other words, defining linguistic areas is not at all straightforward. Some may ask what's the difference of regional accent to regional dialect is. So the accent is simply how one pronounces words, a style of pronunciation, while dialect includes not just the pronunciation but also one's general vocabulary and grammar. So if you are curious what is the differences between the regional and social dialect, let's now have Miss Mayor. Thank you.
Good day everyone, this is Desiree Mayor, your second discussant, and the scope of my report will be about cross-continental variation dialect chains, social variation, and social dialects. So let us first focus to the cross-continental variation dialect chains. To define this, I have noted here some important ideas from the textbook and some also came from the data I had gathered. So we could say that cross-continental variation is a language used by people living in different nearby towns or villages, and there is a chain or a continuum of language connecting one village to another that we call dialect chains. One example regarding with this is the Bicol word for rice. We use the term umay to refer to rice, and it has a wide usage as it is used in different towns in Albay, such as in Ginobatan, in Camalig, and we still use this in some part of Daraga and Legazpi. Given that there's already a border separating these areas from one another, we still use the same word or language that is understandable by one another, so it only means that yes, although two places may not have exactly the same languages, there is still the blending of words that enable us to cite similarities in these bordered towns. So let us have this fifth example from the textbook. Miriam learned French and Italian at a university and was a fluent speaker of both, and as part of her course, she was required to study for 3 months in Paris, which speaks French, and 3 months in Rome, which speaks Italian. Her time in Paris went well, but on her way to Rome, traveling across France to Italy, she was keen to hear the varieties of French and Italian spoken in provincial towns. She stayed in a cheap pensions and made an effort to talk to the local people, and she could understand the French of Dijon and Lyon, but when she moved further from Paris, she started to face difficulties as she found the French difficult to follow, and in the boundary of France and Italy, which is the town of Chambéry, she wasn't already sure what language she was hearing. Was it Italian French or French Italian? Whatever it is, she couldn't really understand. But when she moved further, she found out that Italian spoken in Turin and Milan is different from the Italian she knew, and as she approached to Rome, she gradually began to comprehend what she had heard, and finally in Rome she found similarities between the Italian she spoke and the way Italian around her spoke. So, the situation that Miriam got into illustrates how linguistic features cannot be all straightforward. When there is similarities between the properties of a languages, there's also a properties that may not possess by other languages. Thus, Miriam dealt with this language conflict as she moved across the towns of France and Italy, although it was said that she is a fluent speaker of both French and Italian. So technically, this also shows that intelligibility in language is no help when two languages are involved. So for the next slide, I have posted here the European map. According to the textbook, dialect chains are very common across the whole Europe. One chain connects all the dialects of German, Dutch, Flemish from Switzerland to Austria and Germany to Netherlands and Belgium. Another one links dialect of Portuguese, Spanish, Catalan, French, and Italian, and there's also the Scandinavian chain links between Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish, so is Swedish and Norwegians. So overall, there is 3 dialect chains across the whole Europe that clarify the arbitrariness of distinction between the language and dialect. So if we look at it, it is easy to define what counts as German dialect or Dutch, or Swedish or Norwegian or Italian or French, same with the Philippine dialects. We could define what is Tagalog or Cebuano or Bicolano through its linguistic features. But when setting a boundaries between these dialects, we face challenges. The question will be, where lies the boundaries between these said dialects? Or how will it be still possible if the linguistic feature itself is overlapping one another and usage in one area emerges to another? So, just like what I mentioned earlier, intelligibility is no help. So for instance, Norwegian claim to understand Swedish, although 2 distinct languages are involved, but Chinese who speak only Cantonese cannot understand Mandarin despite of having these 2 dialects, Cantonese and Mandarin, as a Chinese language. We have another example. So Ming is an elderly woman who lives with her son in a rural village near the town of Yingde in Guangdong province in southern China. The family grows vegetable for the local market. Ming speaks only her provincial dialect of Chinese, which is the Cantonese. Last summer, Gong, an official from Beijing in the north, visited her village to check on the level of rice and ginger production. Gong also spoke Chinese, but his dialect was Mandarin or Putonghua, so Ming could not understand a single word Gong said. So in this case, although Ming and Gong speak both Chinese language, they couldn't understand one another as they only knew one linguistic dialects. Language are not purely linguistic entities, meaning they serve a social function, so in order to define a language, it is important to look to its social and political function as well as its linguistic features. So a language can be taught as a collection of dialects that are usually linguistically similar that is used by different social groups who choose to say that they are speaker of one language, which function is to unite and represent them to other groups. This definition is a socio-linguistic rather than linguistic one, as it includes all linguistically very different Chinese dialects, which the Chinese define as one language, while separating the language of Scandinavian, which are linguistically similar but politically different. From here, I will cover the social variation. To begin, let's have the given example from the textbook. So, Diana asks, have you heard Jonathan's engaged to that northern girl from Cumbria? And Reg replied, she may be a northern girl, but I assure you, she is very acceptable. Her father is a lord and a rich one of that. She had the best education money can buy. Those traces of northern accent are fashionable these days. So I think that we could sense a discrimination here for the northern people from Diana's view, so Reg had to defend them, because it is stated that in earlier centuries, I know this may not just about English people, but for almost groups, it is said that English lord or lady can be distinguished through the regional form of English. But in the early 20th century, a person who spoke with a regional accent in England was most unlikely to belong to the upper class. We have here a triangular illustration labeled with highest class RP at the top of a triangle and a lowest class, most localized accent at the bottom. Upper class people, of course, has the privilege to attain upper class education wherein they can learn to speak using RP, which means received pronunciations, and by that, received pronunciation is the accent that only best educated and most prestigious members of English society could attain. It is identified as the Queen's English, and it is also said to be used by Queen Elizabeth II in the movie The Queen that was portrayed by Helen Mirren, although it was the old-fashioned variety of RP that was used in there. While in the lowest class, we can find many linguistic variations because there is a variety of regional differences. So let's note to that in lower class there is a language variation, while in the highest class they only speak the received pronunciation or accent that is used by less than 5% British population only. So imagine if you were a linguist conducting a research in England. You could find different pronunciation of words from the lower class to lower middle to middle class, and of course the one in the upper class. But in other speech communities, it is said that it's possible to hear more than just one accent associated with the highest social groups, unlike the one in RP. Most well-educated and Scots, Irish, and Welsh speakers of English do not use RP, and there is more than one socially prestigious accents in these countries, meaning to say London and Southeast England are the only country who have this role in RP. But while it was said that many people already have the opportunity to learn this by now because it's already been displaced by other accents. RP, being the almighty accent, had a negative reaction reported in Britain, usually by young Londoners who use new accent called Story English, which claimed to be developed along the Thames estuary, some kind of river in London, and that some label this as the new RP. So features of modern urban dialects are rapidly spreading both regionally and socially, allowing the process of leveling to happen. By that leveling is the reducing of dialect and accent variation, and the rapid spread of Story English also reduce regional variation in a large area of South England. So now we have the social dialects. Social dialects are linguistic entities which are distinguishable through vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. This is also how social, regional, and other groups may differ from each other. So earlier, the RP or the received pronunciations is the social accent. Now, Standard English is the social dialects, which is used by social class or occupational group within the society. These social dialects in form of the standard English has its three purposes. First, it is used by well-educated English speakers. Second, it is used for national news broadcasts and in print, and it is also used in the English medium schools. But before we arrive to that, dialects has this stereotyping from an elderly rural person, meaning to say, we could say that this dialect stereotypes came from a person who has no idea about the changes or the modernity or he's untrained because he's a rural base. So the mainly focus of social dialect is the standard English. Unlike RP, standard English is more accommodating and it allows variation within its boundaries, although it's limited. So in example 8, here's two forms of standard English. Allow me to read. I've not washed the dishes yet today, and the other is, I haven't washed the dishes yet today. A trapezoid is used to represent the broader range of standard English because, as what I have said, it allows a limited variation in the field. Just like what I have discussed in the social variation a while ago, the top of the trapezoid is the highest class with some standard dialect variation, and the lowest class is the most localized one and can be regarded as the non-standard one. So now what's the difference between this standard and non-standard dialect? Standard dialect is the more easier one. It accepts a limited amount of grammatical variation and is spoken with many different accents, and there are also many standard Englishes such as the standard English of US, which can be distinguished from South African Standard English and also to Australian, and these three also differ from the British Standard Dialect. Now, what is this non-standard English? Of course, non-standard dialect is the linguistic forms that is not part of the standard one. So, because a standard English is always the first one to be codified, we are now comparing other dialects from the non-standard one to the standard one. And thus, this is how the term invests the negative connotations or a bad idea because it is related to the less prestigious classes, although we must understand that there is nothing regarded as the bad or inferior linguistic. They are just simply in different forms from what is usually used in different discussions from socially prestigious speakers. So to resolve this inferiority in language, the term vernacular occurred and was used by sociolinguists instead of the non-standard. So now, what is this vernacular? Vernacular in sociolinguistics has a variety of meaning. One of that is vernacular is the language that we learned at home, and it differs from standard dialect and also in language features. Vernacular lacks public or overt prestige, meaning to say it is more on informal, though they are valued by their users, especially as a medium of expressing solidarity and effective meaning. So we've been discussing accent and dialect having a stable and absolute linguistic features, but there is a patterned variation in the way people speak. This variation reflects social factors which are significant in a society, and thus the next discussion will be focusing about the relationship between speech and social status. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Chloe Bautista from AB English Language 2A, and I'll be talking about caste dialects, social class dialects, vocabulary, and pronunciations. People can be grouped together on the basis of similar social and economic factors, and people's languages reflect their social grouping when they use different social dialects. According to the textbook, social dialects can be seen clearly in Indonesia and India, where social groupings are very clear because in these countries there are caste systems that is determined by birth and strict social rules governing the behaviors of each group. These rules govern matters like job, marriage, and dressing. These social distinctions are also reflected in speech, and a personal social dialect reflects his social background. For instance, in India, there is a speech difference between Brahmin and non-Brahmin castes, such as the word for milk in Kannada language, which is pronounced halu, and in non-Brahmin dialect it is pronounced as alu. Another, the Javanese language in Indonesia, reflects the social status not just in the choice of linguistic forms, but also in the combinations of forms which each social group uses. Here's an example. An Indonesian student at a British university was trying to explain to her English friend the complications of social dialects in Java and the ways in which Javanese speakers signal their social background. It is much harder than in English, he said. It is not just a matter of saying sofa instead of couch, or house rather than house. Every time you talk to a different person, you have to choose exactly the right words and the right pronunciations. Almost every word is different and they fit together in patterns or levels, depending on who you are talking to. Because I am well educated and come from a rich family, I am expected to use 5 different levels of language. So in example 9, the Indonesian student at a British university says that he has to choose different patterns or styles when speaking to different groups, and in Japanese there are distinguishable stylistic levels. There are 3 distinct social groups and 3 associated dialects. First is the dialect of the lowest status group, such as the peasants or uneducated people. It consists of 3 stylistic levels, 1, 1A, and 2. The second one is the dialect of urbanized people with some education, which consists of 5 stylistic levels, the 1, 1A, 2, 3, and 3A. And the third one is the dialect of the highly educated people, which also consists of 5 levels, 1, 1A, 1B, 3, and 3A. But note that it is different from the dialect of urbanized people that was also mentioned. So in figure 6.1, the illustration provides a couple of words from each level to show the overlap and intermeshing forms involved. Therefore, a particular social dialect in Javanese consists of a particular combination of style levels, and each style has its own vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciations. That's why, as you can see from the given example, it consists of a variety of vocabulary in the given word, and it also differs in pronunciations as what is stated. The term class refers to a group of people who share similarities in economic and social status. Status differences are in relation to family background, wealth, and education. There is a strong relationship between social class and language pattern, and that's why people of different social classes do not speak the same way. Social dialect research in many different countries has revealed a consistent relationship between social class and language patterns. The most obvious differences in vocabulary are in many ways the least illuminating from a sociolinguistic point of view, though they clearly capture the public imagination. In the 1950s in England, many pairs of words were identified which, it was claimed, distinguished the speech of upper-class English people from the rest, or the non-EU speakers. Vocabulary clues are superficial and conceal the complexity and relative fluidity of social class membership in places like Britain, and even more so in the USA. If these differences exist at all, they are rather like those which distinguish Brahmin and non-Brahmin castes. They distinguish social groups on a categorical basis. People can move up or down the social ladder, and this potential mobility is mirrored more accurately in other aspects of their speech, such as pronunciation. On the level of vocabulary, for example, in England, there were words that marked the upper-class English people, or the U speakers from the non-U speakers. For example, U speakers used sitting room rather than lounge, and referred to the lavatory rather than the toilet. Different social groups are often distinguished by the frequency with which they used particular features rather than by their use of completely different forms. This important point can be illustrated with a simple example of two elderly people's accounts of their childhood in Edwardton, Wellington, New Zealand. Usha Praji, a New Zealand student, taped a radio broadcast of her subjects' accounts on a range of social variables. The average scores for socially differentiated groups generally follow exactly this kind of pattern for any linguistic variable where there are clearly identifiable standard and vernacular variants. The way different pronunciations fall into a pattern indicating the social class of the speakers was first demonstrated by William Labov in a study of New York City speech. Some of the linguistic features studied have been found to pattern socially in English-speaking communities all over the world. The pronunciation ing versus in at the end of words like sleeping and swimming, for instance, distinguishes social groups in every community it has been investigated. The people of the lower social groups will pronounce it as in rather than ing, or swimmin', slippin' rather than swimming and slipping. The variable pronunciation of R in words like car and card has proved particularly interesting to sociolinguistics studying English-speaking speech communities. There are two possible variants of the word. Either it is present and pronounced, or it is absent. The higher a person's social group, the more they pronounce R. In New York City, for example, an experiment demonstrated that pronunciation of post-vocalic R varied according to social group. In one city, the higher your social class, the more you pronounce post-vocalic R. In the other, the less you pronounce. The arbitrariness of the particular sounds invested with social significance is probably most obvious in the pronunciation of vowels where the values of the standard forms are entirely determined by the speech of the most prestigious social group. In New York City, older white residents of the Lower East Side use non-Rothic pronunciations to assert their status as authentic New Yorkers. Measuring small but significant differences in vowel pronunciations can seem a nightmare. In his pioneering study of New York speech, Labov measured people's pronunciation of 5 vowels as well as a number of consonants. Measuring slight differences in the way speakers pronounce the same vowels is also a challenging task. Labov developed a scoring system which allowed comparison of the way different social groups pronounced these vowels. In New York, Labov asked different shop assistants where the answer of each was 4th floor. He realized that the more prestigious the shop was, the more people used post-vocalic R. In other places like England, the more prestigious you are, the fewer you pronounce R, like 4th floor. There is nothing inherently bad or good about the pronunciation of any sound, as the different status of R pronunciation in different cities illustrates. In New York City, pronouncing R is generally considered prestigious. In reading in England, it is not. In the Philippines, we can't determine one's social class, wealth, power, or social influence by their pronunciation. Instead, accents of Filipinos can be used to determine the region where they grew up or their ethnicity. It can be through a thick Filipino accent while speaking in English. Filipinos interchange or mix up several consonants and vowels. For example, students will substitute the P in a word for an F, the V and B sounds. Like, hello everyone, my favorite color is purple.
So, according to Dr. Topaz, if I remembered it correctly, when we are talking about pronunciation, linguistic forms, grammar, etc., we are actually not talking about those, but the speakers who produced or used it. So, here in our discussion, I will be going to talk about the speakers regarding their pronunciation a bit and to grammatical patterns. So pronunciation may vary depending on the social group the speaker belongs. For instance, in Paris, the pronunciation of the first vowel may vary depending on the social groups. So, for instance, the word kasser may vary in other social groups pronunciation. So, kasser may pronounce differently in other social groups. That sounds, instead of kasser, it is kosser. So those speakers who speak kasser belongs to a high high social class, while the speakers who speak kosser belongs to lower social class. So here we can see how social groups affect the speech pattern or pronunciation of speakers within a community.
This kind of phenomenon, pronunciation, which indicates the speaker's social class identities, was first demonstrated or introduced by William Labov while he was studying the speech of New York City. It was said that you can collect data by yourself for analyzing pronunciation, but it takes a bit practice to properly distinguish pronunciations, since pronunciations may differ depending on the social class, and properly distinguishing pronunciation is very crucial in this kind of study, because we're talking about pronunciation which was produced by different speakers within a context. But in our modern world, modern technology has been produced, and linguists and researchers now may be able to identify different pronunciation with the help of spectrograph and computer software. And these technologies may objectively, easily, and precisely define the pronunciation produced by various speakers, which has various social classes. Though the emergence of this kind of devices, there are still some people who still use the traditional method of scoring which Labov used. So here I will be deeply discuss the pronunciation, which varies depending on the social classes, and grammatical rule as well. Here we can see in the table that we have two kinds of classes, the professional and the working class. And in the first column, the grammatical rule for L, which is the impersonal construction and personal construction. And based on the given percentage in the table, in this presentation, we can see how social groups differ largely in pronouncing L deletion in French Monchil. And not only that, pronunciation not only differ from social classes but as well as in grammatical rules, which here in L for impersonal construction differ largely as well in the L pronunciation in personal construction. To summary the explanation, pronunciation differ based on its linguistic context and grammar construction. Hence, social factors and linguistic accounts for the patterns of pronunciation within a context. So there is an occurrence of social stratification between social groups or social classes. There is still similar patterns in speech communities that can be shared in other social groups. For instance, the higher social class used more of the standard form, and some of the standard form are shared and can be found by the lower social class, but the use of standard form in lower social class is lesser than the higher social class. I will be discussing the grammatical patterns. When we say grammatical patterns, it is the structurally grammatical sentences that may differ depending on the social groups as well that the speaker belongs. So just like pronunciation, grammatical patterns also differ based on the social groups that the speaker belongs. So in this section, I will be discussing about the grammatical patterns. So in this presentation, we have an example of forms, which is the present tense verb forms, and negative forms, which has examples. In present tense verb forms, we have an example, sentence examples. Rose walks to school every day, and Rose walk to school every day. So in these two statements in present tense verb forms, we can see how sentences are grammatically structured. And the first one, which is Rose walks to school every day, signifies that it is the standard form of English language, which is used by higher social class. While the second sentence, which is Rose walk to school every day, emphasizes to us that this is the non-standard form or vernacular language, which is used by lower social class. So here we can see that grammatical patterns, as just like with pronunciation, also affects the kind of grammatical patterns depending on the social groups or social classes. By the given examples in the present tense verb forms and negative forms, we can see an obvious differences in grammatical patterns between social groups or social classes. So these obvious differences in grammatical patterns between two different social classes are called sharp stratification. When we say social stratification, sharp stratification, we are referring to the distinction of grammar forms between two different social groups. Hence, to summary, just like with pronunciation, grammatical forms or grammatical patterns also depends on the social class that the speakers belongs. So another factor for grammatical pattern is the multiple negation. When we say multiple negation, it refers to the use of two or more negative forms in a statement. For instance, the statement, nobody don't want any chips. So in the statement, we have used two negative forms, which is the nobody and the word don't. So it was said that lower social class is much more frequent in using multiple negation than to higher social class, because high social class are more likely to use only one negative form in their statement. For instance, the statement, nobody wants any chips, and that is a standard form of multiple negation. Nobody don't want any chip. And um, if a speaker starts speaking using multiple negation, we can immediately deduce or calculate what social group that speaker belongs to, in a way that he used multiple negation. And we must not look down in this kind of phenomenon, grammatical pattern, and even in pronunciation, because I think it is language ideologies because of coloniality. If there is coloniality or colonialism in that context. To summary the report, the grammatical patterns and pronunciation always depends on the social groups the speaker belongs. So for instance, of what we discussed about multiple negation and L deletion. So we have recognized that that higher social class only use one negative form in their statements, and the lower social class is much more frequent in using multiple negative forms in their statements. And in pronunciation, in L deletion and Montreal French, we also recognize that pronunciation also depends on the social groups or social status of the speakers. And aside from the social groups, pronunciation also varies depending on the grammar rule. So that is the end of our discussion. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something from us.